If you turn in your Bibles to John, we're in chapter 1 looking at questions Jesus asked. And if you're saying to yourself, well, now, Chad, we left off in John chapter 2 last week. That's true, but I missed a question. So I'm going to circle back to John chapter 1 and look at it. Well, if I can get to John chapter 1. It's in verse 50. We looked at John 1:38, where Jesus asks, "What do you seek?" These two disciples of John. And when you go, really same context basically, but one of those disciples of John that Jesus spoke those words to was Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother. And of course, he goes first. This is, I'm picking up here in verses 40, now in 41. He first finds his own brother, Simon, and that's Peter, of course, and saith unto him, "We have found the Messiah," which is being interpreted the Christ. So Andrew, and we've studied before, Andrew is a soul winner. Andrew's always bringing people to Jesus. There was a lot that was said about this. In fact, some things that I didn't even realize, thinking in terms of Brother Larry Acuff at the funeral yesterday, I knew Brother Larry, anybody who knew Larry even and barely knew him, he was a soul winner, but I just didn't realize how prolific a soul winner he was. But that's Andrew. I mean, every time you read about Andrew, just about in Scripture, he's bringing someone to Jesus. It may be bringing somebody to become a disciple of Jesus. It may be when you get over in John chapter 12, there's just some Greeks at this feast, and they say, "We would see Jesus." In other words, kind of put that more in modern, how we would say it, we want to see Jesus. We want to speak to him. And so Andrew, he goes and he's going to help facilitate making that happen, bringing people to speak to the Savior. But he's always doing that. Just about every time maybe fair to say every time we read about him in Scripture. So he goes and he gets his brother Simon or Peter, brings him to Jesus, and Jesus beholds him, verse 42. "Thou art Simon the son of Jonah, thou shalt be called Cephas," which is by interpretation a stone. Then Jesus the next day goes forth into Galilee, and he finds Philip. He says to him, "Follow me." Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So he's from the same city as Peter and Andrew. "Philip findeth Nathanael, and saith unto him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, Come and see." And of course, we've talked about that phrase when we were looking at the question from John 1:38. "But Jesus sees Nathanael coming," verse 47, "and he says, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile, no deceit." I think is how some versions have. Anybody got a New King James? I keep forgetting I've got it right here. No deceit. That's ESV. I got a New King James here. Yeah, same thing. So no guile, no deceit, in other words. Then Nathanael says, "Whence knowest thou me?" "How do you know me?" Nathanael asks. Jesus answered and said unto him, "Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee." And so Nathanael says, verse 49, "Rabbi, thou art the Son of God. Thou art the King of Israel." So somehow or another and there's all kind of speculation about what, this idea of being under the fig tree and that being a Jewish term for study and things like that. But regardless, it's a situation where Nathanael knew Jesus could not have seen him. There's something miraculous, some miraculous element to this. And so when Jesus says, "Before Nathanael even came to get you, I saw you under the fig tree," And possibly even, again, sometimes people speculate there's an implication there He knew, maybe some commentators just get kind of wild with this, speculating that what he was studying was from the prophets about the coming Messiah. And so Jesus alludes to that, and that's why he goes, "Oh, wow, Rabbi, you're the Son of God, you're the King of Israel." Maybe, but that requires some assumption that I don't know that you could say that with any kind of certainty. I'll just put it that way. It would certainly make sense, but anyway, so he says, you are the Son of God, you're the King of Israel. Whatever Jesus said, he knows there's an element of miraculous knowledge with that. And he's sort of taken aback, and he says, wow, you are the Son of God, you're the King of Israel. Now bear in mind that Philip has said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and in the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Philip, he says to Nathanael, we've found the Christ. And so, Nathanael's sort of skeptical. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And he says, well, come and see. And then Jesus makes this statement. Now, let me put a peg there and say this. We were talking, no, it wasn't last week because we had the ice and the snow and stuff. So it was 2 weeks ago. I was thinking, I knew it didn't seem like last week, but it was last class. We were talking about in John chapter 2, where it mentions this is the first miracle Jesus did. Would seem clear to be the first public miracle. Because here in John 1, in this context right here, we are leading up to this question in verse 50, it's pretty evident to Nathanael, and even just reading it for us, Jesus says, I saw you. Jesus wasn't there. He wasn't in eyesight, but he says, I saw you when you're under the fig tree. And Nathanael recognizes that, and so he says, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. Rabbi, of course, there meaning teacher, but here in this context, you are the Rabbi, the teacher, the Messiah, the Christ. And so Jesus then answers, and here's the question that we're looking at. Because I said unto thee, I saw thee under the fig tree, believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. And so he asks him a question. In other words, how is it worded in the New King James? Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? I was thinking there was, let me look at the ESV here. I was thinking there was another one. No. I was thinking I'd seen it worded a way that I liked a little bit better. But I'm just not seeing it now. I thought I had seen one, but maybe it was a different translation I looked at. New American Standard Bible says, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? But it's a question to sort of draw his attention, like, if you want to paraphrase it how we might say it, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, you believe because of that? You ain't seen nothing yet. So he's drawing his attention to the fact that, well, yeah, Jesus doesn't deny that he's showing a miraculous knowledge, the omniscience of God in the flesh. But he also says to him, hey, just buckle up, because you're going to see a lot greater things than that. And so there's that question in John 1:50. But again, looking at this context, you see that, in fact, that's how I realized I had skipped a question, was Scott or somebody was talking about the statement that Jesus made to him about, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. So we know John 2 is not the first miracle, period. And that may tie in with what Jesus says to Mary. And just realized I forgot. I had printed out the AP, or I had saved the Apologetics Press article where Jesus says to his mother, the way the King James words it, has him saying, woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour has not yet come. And Eric Lyon's article on showing that wasn't a rude statement. If we said it that way today, I've tell young people I don't recommend you if your mom makes a request of you that you say, "Woman, what do I have to do with thee?" It probably won't turn out well. But in that time, it was a very affectionate way. And I like what, I was trying to remember what, I read a particular commentator. It might have been James Burton Kaufman, or it might have been McGarvey, Fourfold Gospel. Anyway, it was one of the commentators that I was reading on that. He made the statement, or I think it might have been somebody that Eric was quoting. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of, is in that article. But he said, Jesus seems to be indicating in that question, not disrespect by any stretch, and it's verifiable that was not a disrespectful way in that culture for a grown Jewish man to speak to his mother, or any lady for that matter. But this guy was saying it seems to indicate a changing of the relationship. And that's that phrase, what do I have to do with thee? You could show verifiably that reference, that starting off with woman is not disrespectful. But somebody may say, well, then he just goes on to say, what do I have to do with you? But that's not disrespectful either. What he's saying is there's going to be a changing of the relationship. And Adam and I were talking last class 2 weeks ago, and we don't know this for sure, but it may well be that at some point when he still was at home, or maybe even since reaching that age where he had had his baptism, that seemed to kind of was the beginning of his ministry. Maybe since that point, something that's not recorded, where maybe in a private setting for his mom, for his family, he had done something miraculous in a private type setting like that. And maybe she's thinking in terms of that, and Jesus is sort of saying, hey, this is different. You can't just come to me and I'm miracles on demand. And so he's not being ugly in any way or form, but he's just saying things are going to be a little bit different. You're mom, and you will always be mom in a sense, but now I'm starting my ministry, and I'm going to be doing the Father's will, and I'm on the Father's timetable, not yours. But at the same time, she knows enough to know. She goes to those servants, and she says, whatever he says, do it. And, of course, he ends up making the grape juice. Yes, sir? Absolutely. It shows there in John 1 with the statement to Nathanael. Yeah, it shows omniscience, omnipresence. And this is an interesting thing you'll see in John. Sometimes people talk about 7 major miracles highlighted in John, showing Jesus' power over different things. And I think you see it as you go through John. But even in a little, I don't know if I say little, but just kind of tucked in here in the middle of an account, a historical account of how some people became Jesus' disciples, even tucked right in that, you see an example of Jesus, his omniscience, but also omnipresence. And you'll see this theme going through the book of John, and I realize it's getting a little bit away from our questions thing, but it's so fascinating. Every time I study John, you'll see Jesus, he will, for instance, he shows he is Lord over time. I mean, who among us can't appreciate that? When you've got something to do and you say, I got to do this, but I need to be doing that. I really need to be doing this too, but I just don't have enough time. That was never a concern for Jesus. He's Lord over time. Now, in a sense, it was a concern for him because he lived on this earth as a human, and he learned to make the most of time, and he set an example for us in that. But in another sense, as we pointed out last class, keep wanting to say last week, but as we pointed out in our last class, hey, God's been changing water into grape juice for thousands of years. The miracle here in John 2 is the water becoming grape juice in an instant. I mean, he's Lord over time. And then you get to John chapter 4, and you got a guy that says, hey, come here, my servant is sick. And Jesus says, he's healed. And the guy believes, and he goes home, and people meet him, and they say, I said servant, is it son? Doubting myself here. Son, yeah, this nobleman's son. And the servants come out, and they say to him, your son's better. He recovered. And the father says, what? Well, hey, when did that happen? Well, it was yesterday at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, whatever. They were not told the exact time. And he knew it was the hour. I mean, the moment Jesus said, your son's healed. So he's not just Lord over time. He's Lord over space, distance, omnipresent, as Gary pointed out. And you see that again right here in John 1. Later on, he's going to cast out demons. He's Lord over the spirit world. But not just demons, because in John chapter 11, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's Lord over death itself. John chapter 6, he's going to take little bits of bread, fish, and he's going to just continue to multiply it. He's Lord over matter. He's Lord of all. And so, yes, sir.
It's amazing that we read these accounts, but when you think about it, he's the creator of all things. All things were created by him, and there was nothing that was created that was not created by him. So when we read these accounts, we're amazed at the amount of miracles that he did, but he created everything.
Yeah. And so, in one sense, it's nothing. It's nothing to him to heal someone, to cast out demons, to raise someone from the dead. Speaking of healing, he's Lord over sickness. He's going to heal a man who is paralyzed, a paralytic, John chapter 5. He's going to heal a man who was born blind, John chapter 9. I wish I could remember. I need to speak to him again and get the details of that. But Dr. Berry, who attends down at Carrollton, was telling me one time how amazing that is. Like, even with our technology, there's a lot of things that we can, do. And in fact, there's a brother over in Childersburg used to go to, maybe still does, would go on these mission trips to Panama, and they would do, he may go on the medical missions with Latin American missions, I'm not sure. But they would go on these medical missions, and they would take, I forget the name, eye doctors. I'll use my southern term, ophthalmologist. That's ophthalmologist. And they would take one or two of them, and they would I guess, take the machines with them to remove cataracts. And Brother Mike Ray was the guy's name over in Childersburg, and he said it was kind of like, it felt like we're in New Testament times, because he said there are people that have so bad cataracts that for all intents and purposes, they were blind. And you use those machines, it's such a simple thing, but they just didn't have it down there. And now they can see. And he said, you'd see the look on people's faces, how excited they were, ecstatic. And he said, I wonder, it had to be a little taste of what it must have been like when people were healed by Jesus. But Dr. Barry was telling me, even with all that we can do with things like that, he said there's nothing you can do to help someone who was born blind. And he explained medically why that's the case, and I just don't remember all those details, but pretty fascinating to hear. And he said, even sometimes people will say, well, we can heal paralytics today. And with the understanding, we know, even still, with medical technology and things, it's not going to be just done. But still, even if somebody were to say something like that, he said, there's nothing you can do for somebody that's born blind. Absolutely nothing, because there's something that has not developed, grown, whatever, and it's impossible. And here's Jesus. He just heals this man who was born blind. So Lord over sickness. It's just Lord over all. And as Robert pointed out, he's the creator of all, and so that makes sense. And that's how he verified his claim that he is creator of all, that he's God in the flesh. He's the Son of God. He's bringing a message authorized by God, from God the Father. That's a bold claim to make. I hope you can back it up. Well, you better believe he did. So, and I wanted to go back to that question in John 1:50 because I had just overlooked that, but that's that question. And then again, we talked about John chapter 2, verse 4, and Jesus talking there, telling his mother, gently, respectfully saying to her essentially, hey, things are going to change a little bit. And to her credit, she just says to the people, you just do whatever he says. All right, anything else on those?
One thing.
Yes, sir.
I think Nathaniel knew what he was looking for. I think he had a certain amount of faith, quite a bit really, probably because of his knowledge of the Old Testament, knowing that this one thing that he saw, he understood who it was immediately. And we see degrees of that. Back then, through all the people Jesus encountered, many people discounted his miracles and didn't realize who he was. But so as he witnessed to this, he knew who he was in the presence of. And today we see people the same way in our evangelism. We see people that know what they're looking for, and there's, the way to say it, maybe they're easier to convince because they have an idea of what they're looking for. They know the identifying marks from them. And some people don't. So it appears to me Nathaniel knew what he was looking for.
And that, I never really thought about it, at least not the connection. That's interesting, kind of an interesting segue to our next question. If you didn't hear Jimmy's point, Jimmy was saying it seems Nathaniel knew what he was looking for. And that would have had to have come from a knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures. And again, that goes back to, I think, why you have sometimes commentators will speculate this phrase under the fig tree, and a lot of times that's where a Jewish man would do study under the fig tree. I've even seen some that say it was just a figurative expression, or it came to be a figurative expression. But if he was indeed studying, and that's what that's a reference to, well, he probably would have been studying something about the coming Messiah, and that would make sense. But again, all that speculation. But it does seem, as Jimmy pointed out, he knew what he was looking for. He knew something about the Messiah from the Old Testament scriptures. And so when he comes to Jesus and he sees some evidence, it's not just this, well, I don't know about this. And, again, as Jimmy pointed out, you got some people, they see an indisputable miracle and yet still doubt, question, wonder. Some even just didn't believe. But Nathaniel says, you are the Son of God, Rabbi. You are the King of Israel. He knew what he was looking for, and when he found it, he said, here it is. And I say that's an interesting segue because if you go into John chapter 10, it's verse 10 of John chapter 3 is our next question. And this context, really the first several verses of John chapter 3, is Jesus speaking to Nicodemus. Nicodemus comes to Jesus. He's a ruler of the Jews. Comes to him by night. Do you know why he came to him by night? I don't either. Let's move on. What do you want? People sometimes just dwell on that and go on and on and on about why did he come to him by night? Well, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. Then he says to him, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher come from God. And so he's not with some of the leaders that are just kind of like, and some of them will even go so far, it seems later on, not necessarily this early, but some of them are even going to go so far when they can't deny the miracles to say, well, sure, it's a miracle, but he's doing miracles by the power of Satan, which Jesus will show is logically ridiculous. It's just illogical is what it is. But he says, we know you're a teacher come from God because for no man can do these miracles that thou doest, except God be with him. You've got to be a teacher from God. You couldn't be doing these miracles. If that wasn't the case. By the way, that's going to be the blind man's logic as well when they start trying to accuse him. Oh, give God the glory. This man is a sinner. Talking about Jesus, they say that. And the blind man kind of seems pretty clear. He's getting pretty sarcastic. Why, here's a marvelous thing. I mean, you say he's a sinner, and yet he opened my eyes. It's never been heard of that you could open the eyes of one who was born blind. And he'll go on to say, we know God doesn't hear sinners, but if any man does his will, he's accepted with him. So you tell me. And boy, that really makes him mad. But that poor blind man, he gets a lot of grief from those unbelieving Jewish leaders. But Nicodemus seems as searching. But it's kind of ironic because, to Jimmy's point, Nathaniel seems to know better what he's looking for than Nicodemus. And so what is the question Jesus asks in verse 10?
You a teacher from Israel and do not know these things?
Yeah, in the King James, it's got it as what, a ruler, I think? Master. Art thou a master of Israel? I like the way the New King James puts it. Are you the teacher of Israel and do not know these things? Are you the teacher of Israel and you don't know all this? He asks a pretty stern question, and most of the newer versions have it that way. Are you the teacher? And it's not to say that there aren't other teachers. That's not the implication. But it's kind of like, you're the teacher of the class, and you don't know this? And Jesus is not trying to be ugly. He's not trying to be a smart aleck, but he's trying to make a point. And I think putting that together with Jimmy's observation, I think that's very interesting. It's almost like he's trying to make the point, like he doesn't connect it, but thinking about it in terms of, here's Nathaniel. He knew what he was looking for. Student of the Scriptures. And when he finds it, he goes, there it is. You are the Christ. You are the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. Nicodemus, who of all people should have known exactly what he was looking for, and when he saw it, said, there it is, and pointed everybody else to him. And yet, he's sitting here. Now, look, again, he's not like some of the Jews that are just unbelieving. But he's sort of scratching his head like, I'm struggling with this, Jesus. And Jesus is like, you're the teacher? You don't know these things? And, of course, when you read those verses leading up to verse 10, Jesus makes the statement, verse 3, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus is kind of like, what? How is a man born when he's old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Do you remember we talked about this? We've talked about it numerous times, even, but especially when we studied the book of John. There's a recurring theme in John. Jesus will talk about something spiritual, and the people will take it very literally. He'll talk about something that's physical, but he's making a spiritual reference. First time you see it is in John chapter 2, when he talks about, is that right, John 2? I feel like that's, yes. I don't know, I doubted myself there. They ask for a sign in verse 18 of John chapter 2, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And much like Nicodemus, they're kind of like, huh? This temple's been 46 years in building, buddy. You just get 3 days, raise it up. And they're kind of like, get real. But John tells us there he was speaking of the temple of his body. It's a prophecy of his resurrection. Then you come to John chapter 3. Except a man be born again, he cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And Nicodemus, what? What's going to happen again in chapter 4? If you drink of this water, you'll thirst again. But if you'd known who you were talking to, you'd asked him and he'd have given you living water. you wouldn't thirst again. And she says, all right, let's have it. I don't want to keep coming to this well to draw water. She's thinking physical, literal, and so is Nicodemus here. And so Jesus says, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And he, again, as we pointed out before, he rules out this is nothing related to childbirth at all, because that which is born of the flesh is flesh, that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Marvel not, I said unto thee, you must be born again. The wind blows where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit. You don't see the wind, you see the effects. And so it is with one who is born of the Spirit. And Nicodemus, bless his heart, and I say bless his heart, we'd probably be the same if we were in his shoes. It's easy to look back having the big picture and to be hard on some of these Bible characters, and I try to be careful about that, because I know how obtuse old Chad can be and how stubborn old Chad can be, and so probably in a lot of these situations I would have been the same way. Hopefully not, but it's all too easy to sit here and be hard on some of these folks. But Nicodemus is still struggling with it, and he's kind of like, how can these things be? Sometimes a student is wrestling with something. Sometimes even a student who should be the teacher. And that's the point of Jesus' question there in verse 10. One time when I mentioned a teacher of mine that, I think it was in this particular class, that she, I loved her as a teacher, but she was a pistol. She was a fireball. And I had, my schedule had gotten somehow messed up, and I'd gotten put in a trigonometry class, but I had not taken geometry before, and it was just a struggle all semester, just such a struggle, because I didn't have that background. And I think it was in that class, I think second semester we did Algebra 3. And I was okay when we got to just algebra, because I'd had Algebra 1 and I'd had Algebra 2. But we were, I don't know, I was just wrestling with, for some reason, one day, the fact that when you multiply a negative times a negative, I hope I say this right. Man, I'm not good at math. You get a positive, right? Okay. So a negative times a negative is a positive. And in my mind, I still can't understand that. There's some things you just have to memorize, folks. And that's Brother Moser used to tell us that when you're studying Greek or any language. He said, don't try to understand it, just memorize it. But I'm thinking like, okay, so maybe here's your zero on the little linear line there. Here's your zero. You got -3. Times -3 gives you +9. Am I right? Is that right? I'll make sure I say it right. Man, it's been a long time. But I'm like, I'm telling Miss Skinner, was her name, and I'm like, but -3, and that's what times means, like 3 times 3 is 3 times. -3 3 times, if you go -3 plus -3, -6. Plus another -3 is -9. Why does it suddenly become +9 just because you say times? And she's like, it just does, Dollahite. And old Dollahite, that's not good enough. And I mean, honestly, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I wasn't trying to be a smart aleck. I just said, I don't get that. And she says, well, and again, she was a fireball, sweet lady most of the time. But it addled her for some reason. And me and her got sideways with one another that day. And she said, you don't have to understand it, but it does. And I said, well, I mean, I acknowledge that, but do you see what I'm saying? -3, 3 times. -3, -3, that's -9. No, it's not. I said, Miss Skinner, if you do -3 plus -3 plus -3, what's that? -9. -3 times -3, that's 9. +9. I said, it doesn't make sense. I don't, that can't be right. And when I said that, that got her. And buddy, she said, you listen to me. And I, again, I guess she took it as me saying, you are wrong. And I wasn't. I was just wrestling with it in my mind. That can't be right. And that's where Nicodemus is here. He says, how can these things be? And Nicodemus is, and that's the reason Jesus' rebuke is it's not really even a rebuke. I would call it more of a reproof, a mild reproof. Jesus is not any stronger than he is because he knows, again, omniscience, he knows Nicodemus' heart. And he knows he's not questioning God. He's not questioning, even though he doesn't quite understand Jesus is God in the flesh at this point, he's not questioning God the Father and his working of things. Miss Skinner did not know my heart, and she took it that way. And, buddy, she was upset. And I just dropped that quickly and decided I'd just memorize it. Negative times negative is a positive. Because she took it as I'm trying to tell her she was wrong, and I wasn't. I was just trying to understand it. Here we are, 30-something years later, and I still don't understand it. But Nicodemus says, how can these things be? And Jesus says, are you a master of Israel? You the teacher of Israel, and you don't know these things? The implication is you should know these things. Man, you ought to know this. And so, again, I think Jimmy's point is very interesting because you got Nathaniel, who seems to know what he's looking for. He acknowledges it when he finds it. And then you got Nicodemus here, who's he's really struggling with it. And he's just, so Jesus kind of a mild reproof, saying, hey, you should, as a teacher, a leader of the Jewish people, religion, you should have a better perception, understanding of these things. Yes, sir.
Nicodemus apparently didn't know what he was looking for completely. He knew he was from God, but I think he was skewed in what the Messiah would look like by some of the things that the group, the priests and the people that day had injected into it.
And sometimes people have these misconceptions, and that it seems that's what Nicodemus maybe had some misconceptions about the Messiah. He thinks, well, yeah, obviously you're a teacher come from God. And you'll see this again. It's the theme in the book of John. Sometimes people will say, well, what do you think about Jesus? Some will say, well, he's a good man. Some will say he's a prophet. Some will say he's the prophet. Some say he's the Christ. And of course, biblically, when you study the Old Testament, there's no distinction between the prophet. The prophet there being a reference to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses says, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you like unto me. And so some of the Jews apparently had made a distinction between the prophet and the Christ. But contextually in the Old Testament scriptures, there's no difference. It's the same individual. And really, before we run out of time, let's look at verse 12, because this is the next question. We want to get it because it's right here in the same context. So Jesus, after he asked that question in verse 10, says, verily, verily, truly, truly, I say unto thee, we speak that we do know, and testify that we have seen, and ye receive not our witness. He's speaking here in the plural. Seemed to be him and the Father. Would be the same. Seemed to be who he's talking about there. But here's the next question, verse 12. If I've told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you receive if I tell you? How shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? And so he's, again, this is a question asked to Nicodemus. He's kind of saying you ought to have better perception, understanding of these spiritual matters. And Nicodemus, to his credit, he'll grow in his understanding. He's going to meditate on this. This is not the last we'll see of Nicodemus. In fact, if you'll turn over in the book of John to chapter 7, the people are, they're upset because they had sent officers to take Jesus, John 7:45. And they come back empty-handed. They want to know in verse 45, why have you not brought him? The officers answered, never man spake like this man. Oh, that just, you can just see how that would incense those Pharisees. Are you also deceived? Verse 47. Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees, any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed on him? So what? That's like saying, hey, I found something in the Bible, but that's different from what I've heard preached here at at the congregation, but the Bible clearly says something different, and somebody says, well, can't be true. Have you ever heard your preacher preach that? Must not be true. Well, no, folks, the Bible's right. And so what a ridiculous statement for these rulers to make. Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed on him? Well, guess what? They're not the authority. God is the authority. But this people who knoweth not the law are cursed, they say. Well, amen to that. They just condemn their own selves. But Nicodemus, in verse 50, stands up for Jesus. And he says, does our law judge any man before it hears him? Knows what he does? Oh, they got mad. You also of Galilee, Nicodemus? They start to kind of mock and insult him. Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. How ironic. Because you know what? There was a prophet of Galilee. His name was Jonah. So, shows how much they knew. But Nicodemus, he comes along in his understanding, and he'll even later on come in John chapter 19, along with Joseph of Arimathea, to help bury the body of Jesus. But he's struggling here. And again, you see that. You see the wheels are turning, and he's learning. And that's why Jesus is not just, scathing rebuke, as he'll sometimes give to some of those just non-believing Jewish leaders. But he's saying, come on, Nicodemus, if I'm telling you earthly things and you don't believe, how are you going to believe if I tell you heavenly things? You want to know more, you got to get past your preconceptions, Nicodemus. You got to believe. And so what can keep people from grasping, from understanding the truth? There are a lot of things that can do that. Well, I'm out of time, so I'm gonna mark that. I hate to stop in the middle of. We can at least circle back to that and make that point, because I think it's interesting to consider, especially in light of Nicodemus and his misunderstanding. What exactly can cause people, even to this day, to misunderstand, to not believe the truth? What is today, the 19th? So I'll just put a note, start there on the 26th. Because there are a number of things that can do that then and now. But we'll stop there, and Lord willing, we will pick up with that point and then go to our next question in John chapter 4 next Sunday morning. Thank y'all very much. We'll have a short break before worship begins.